So, Chris McDade, thank you very much for joining us. Pleasure to have you on the podcast. Actually, before we get going, I owe you a thank you. You and your predecessor. We were at an IMRS dinner and we spoke about the podcast. You guys pushed me that much on why I should do it, or not why I should do it, but what was the point in it, that it made me kind of refine my ideas a bit better. So, yeah, big thank you for that. So, I've done an intro, but if you don't mind telling the listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thanks very much, Gordon, for having us along. I suppose, I should really thank my predecessor, Ian, for volunteering me for this, even though he's retired into the sunset and I've been dropped in it. So, yeah, thanks, Ian. My name's Chris McDade. I head up operations for TK Gas here in Glasgow. So, my actual title is Vice President Gas Operations. The reason it's gas operations and not gas fleet or anything like that is because, as well as the LNG vessels that we have, we also have a terminal in Bahrain as well. So I'm responsible for that section of the business as well.
How did you actually get into the industry and start?
It's like everything when you're in high school, you don't really know what you want to do. So I kind of kicked around the idea like going into the armed forces. God help me, at one point I was even thinking of the RAF. It was my grandfather, so my cousin, or my second cousin I should say, John. He'd started an engineering cadetship. He was like a year ahead of me. He'd started with mobile shipping. At the time, my granddad sort of suggested it and I thought, yeah, okay, that sounds good. Obviously, at that time, it was only engineering or deck that you could do, and it was literally a tick in the box. Me being me, didn't really fancy getting my hands dirty or working in a big manky engine room, so decided to go along the deck officer route. My grandfather's brother, who was a steward on the whiskey boats that used to go between Kelvin Hall and Canada, when I told him that I picked a deck, and it was his grandson, John, obviously, who's an engineer, he's like, just as well, son, because engineers call themselves officers, but they aren't. Right? So he was quite happy about that. John, not so much. So yeah, started in 1997, I think it was, as a squeaky voice wee deck cadet. I went with Clyde Marine Training, but at that time they were responsible for mobile. At the time when you were doing it, and I think it's the same, you don't actually pick the company that you want to go with. You can sort of put your preference. And then obviously I think I'd tablet Blue Funnel Line, which was like a banana company that used to, run refrigerated cargoes, and the other one was mobile. And I got mobile because my cousin was in it, so that's literally it. Sorry.
Did you pick mobile or did you?
I picked it, right. So mobile was my first choice. Blue Funnel was the second one, and that's how literally I fell into the sort of oil and gas sphere. Sat in the Halls of Residence canteen in the Nautical College at the Gorbals on a Monday in September, and just getting your name read out. Mobile shipping, stood up, went and got the company tie, and that was it.
What about a luck that is, to be fair, seeing you think about the small decisions. Jeez.
It is, and it's funny when you think about it. It's that that little gateway, as it were, and that's what sort of starts your career off. And one of the guys who was sat next to me, and we're still really good friends now, he got an offshore company, and I always remember, and we still slag him for it, that he was nearly crying when he got told he was working for a company in the North Sea and wasn't getting to, put it in inverted commas, travel the world, proper gutted. And I'll have to remind him of that to this day.
I suppose you owe your second cousin a few beers then.
I think the last I heard from him, he's out working for the Sultan of Oman on private yachts. It's funny how careers sort of diverge. He's out doing that.
So we go from there then, and then you went from mobile shipping. How long were you with them before you went to BP?
So I completed my cadetship with Mobil at the time. So Mobil was a great company to work with. They had lots of old tonnage. So I was working, my first ship was a 33-year-old product tanker down in East Africa, which was an absolute midden. Nothing worked. It was all manual valves. But the good thing about that, and it's, hindsight's great when you look back on stuff, obviously, with rose-tinted glasses, it really allowed you to sort of learn your craft, as it were, about tanker operations, because when you were stripping out the tanks, that's when the levels getting to the bottom. Because it was manual valves, we used to say, you shouldn't do it these days, but you would lift up the Butterworth plate, and with a heliograph, which is like the shiny mirror they use to attract attention when you're in a lifeboat, we would use that to reflect the sun down into the tank to what's called the elephant's foot, where the suction of the pump was. And you could see, as you had someone on the valve closing it in, you could see the effect on it. So that was really good when you eventually moved into new tonnage and you're in a control room and everything's remote. You understand the impact that you're having when you're throttling valves because you've actually seen it. So being as like a first trip deck cadet, you're never going to get experience like that again. That's something that you can't replicate anywhere. So did that. I think in 2001, Mobil was taken over or joined with Exxon. So it then became Exxon Mobil. Exxon being Exxon were extremely squeamish about having any sort of tonnage attached to them. So they were getting rid of the ships. When I finished cadetship, my training officer down in London had said, look, if you can get something else, we won't hold you to your 2-year contract because basically it's the end of shipping for us. Very fortunately for me at that time, BP were going through a huge fleet expansion program. Basically fired off an email to the Isle of Man who did the manning for BP and given a job immediately. Right, there was no messing around. Flew over to the Isle of Man, did some paperwork, and then I joined my first ship as third mate like a week later down in Australia. So it's interesting. You fast forward now to these times where you've got lots of newly qualified officers where that story just wouldn't replicate to what it was then. So I started with BP, I think it was in April 2002, initially on the oil fleet. So when I joined the first ship, again, older tonnage, the British skill that was actually built in Belfast. And I think you had
John Wood,
Harlan Wolff, everything, you know, around all the Fairleads, Belfast, Harlan Wolff, all that sort of stuff. So that was my first BP ship.
I think it was a Canterbury. So the first vessel that he was on was built at Harlan and Wolff as well.
But even then, I think, because the S-class were all built in British yards, the Success, Skill, the other ones were built in Newcastle, one was on the Clyde as well. I think that they were the last BP tankers ever to be built in the UK. So it was a really well built ship, obviously, quite a funny looking accommodation where it was almost like a castle. It did have the extended bridge wings out. That was a nice ship to join, especially that run. It was going between the Gulf and Australia, so it was good. I actually even got shore leave, amazingly.
Sounds pretty good anyway, to be honest, but oil then for a few years, and before you went on to, did you start with LPG or did you start on LNG?
I'll just give you a run through the whole BP. See, I did 2 trips on oil with BP. So did the Skill, then did the Laurel, which was new build coming out of Japan. So that was part of that fleet expansion. So that was an Aframax. And from there, I moved over to gas, where I stayed my entire career with BP. So moved over to the trader class, which was steam Mark III membrane ships, trading between, well, basically everywhere, to be honest, but mainly trading between like Arabian Gulf to Spain, like Barcelona, Cartagena, did some ports down there. That was quite a regular run for us. And then switched over to Trinidad, East Coast at that time, actually. So we were loading in Trinidad and discharging at a terminal called Cove Point, which these days is now an export terminal. So it shows you what's happened, you know, in terms of sort of LNG cycle. So yeah, stayed on gas, got my mates, got my old mans, and then in 2009 moved over to upstream and production. It's interesting, you make all these wee connections as you go through your career. It was a guy I was in college with, had moved over and he was working on, it was the Savannah Voyager, which comes full tilt, and I'll explain that in a minute, but that was a cylindrical FPSO in the North Sea. I was home on leave. And actually, I think I might have been doing some moonlighting on the Stena Caledonia, right, to get some, for whatever reason, I got asked by.
Don't admit
it. So I was working on there, and it's one of these things you always remember. Right? I took a phone call, and I was on the car deck, and it was my friend. He's like, listen, there's a job came up in the other installation in the North Sea on the cylindrical FPSO, and that was the Savannah Hummingbird. The first of its kind. It hadn't been done before, and the reason it was cylindrical, it had a small capacity, and the idea was it would go into fields where it was only like a couple of years field life, so it wasn't worth putting in all the infrastructure. And it would go on station, suck up all the oil from the wells, and then be towed off and go to another one, like a Hummingbird, right, where it sort of takes it and then moves off. She's like, do you fancy it? And I was like, well, I had the interview in Aberdeen, and bearing in mind, I haven't probably done an interview since a proper one since I started as a cadet in 1997. So I did this interview, and without a doubt, Gordon, it was the most technical interview I've ever had in my life. And even to this day, I don't even know how I passed it, because they gave us, and bearing in mind, I've been working in LNG since 2003. I hadn't been near an oil vessel, crude oil washing or inert gas or anything like that, and got plumped down in this boardroom in Aberdeen, throwing a diagram of this cylindrical FPSO with a cargo tank arrangement, and get asked how I would load it and how I would discharge it. And I had to go through how I would go about doing stability on something that is completely unique. Obviously, I've done it right because I got the job.
Thank goodness.
From moving into upstream and production, that was a real baptism of fire, right? Coming from BP, there is a level of arrogance, right, in shipping where you think, I work in BP, nobody can tell me anything when it comes to safety and control of work and isolation standards, all of this sort of stuff. And I work in LNG, that's at the forefront of all sort of shipping operations. And then you go on this FPSO and you are taken back to school in a big, big way, because the level of control of work, risk assessment, isolation standards is far and above, so much superior than what you would experience in any kind of shipping company.
Right. It's amazing. It's obviously it's a totally different, well, it's not totally different, but it's different in terms of press as well. So there's a lot of these things that comes from the media perception of the oil industry that has to be that way?
It's because obviously you've got STCW and ISM and all these sort of things that govern shipping, but you've got in the North Sea, in the British sector particularly, you've got the Health and Safety Executive, which are no joke, and they're no joke coming on from, you know, the Cullen inquiry, which was following on Paper Alpha, all the sort of the standards that they've got to protect people, and that's what it is. So it was a really, really steep learning curve, but something that was incredibly enjoyable. But it was a really difficult job in terms of just getting yourself up to that standard, what's expected from an offshore point of view.
So when you made the move then from obviously sailing, what was the thought process behind it? Was it family related? Did you feel as if it was time to just come ashore?
No. It's, and my personal life is a wee bit, or private life rather, is a wee bit different because my wife's in the same industry. So we actually met each other when we were cadets in college. So I'm quite fortunate in the sense of I don't have one of these sort of home lives where you're expected to be home and the pressure to, you know, leave deep sea and get something closer to home. Never had that, to be honest. I think the main thing really was, don't get me wrong, the leave rotation was considerably better, right? It was 2 weeks on, 3 weeks off, right? Which at that time, fantastic. It was just something, it was just more of a new challenge, not something that I'd done before. So there wasn't like a conscious decision where I thought I wanted to get out of shipping or anything like that. There wasn't threat of redundancy. There was talk of like shrinking the fleet or anything like that. I was coming from a very comfortable, stable company, but this just came up. It really was something a bit different. And it's one of these things similar to back when I was choosing my company for Mobil. It was one of these things where doing that then opened up so many more other opportunities along the way and really sort of shaped, I suppose, sort of helped me put me on the path to the position that I'm in at the moment, because you do have that other strand to your bow, as it were. You've got something a bit different from your average person that's been in shipping their entire career.
Have you finished up with the Navy?
Obviously, I was in the...
Did you run out of time? Have you not got enough time anymore?
Just not got enough time. I mean, obviously, I was in the Royal Navy Reserve since 2009. Which is probably, I think it was roughly the same time that I came into the North Sea, because obviously all this leave, 3 weeks off, fantastic, you could plan stuff. And it's something that I always fancied doing. And again, that was more of a challenge where I wanted to see if I could do it, right?
What do you mean by that? See if you could do what?
See if you could actually pass my commission, right? So if I could go down and sit the Admiralty interview board and then go to Dartmouth at BRNC and pass everything that you have to pass as part of your initial naval officer training, because it's not easy, right? Days gone by, it used to be if you were a master mariner, you would just basically walk into the Navy like, here's your lieutenant grade and your sword, welcome aboard. Then they changed it, and rightly so, because obviously it's a little bit of a different skill set where you had to go down and follow the same process that everyone else done. But upon passing your initial naval training and your fleet boards and sea time, because you also have to do like a mini orals for the Navy, right? So you go and do your fleet time, which is generally on a capital ship, which is like Ocean, Albion, like an LPD or an LPH at that time, or we actually even had Illustrious, and then come back and be examined by, it's normally like a 4-ringer, a captain and 2 commanders, through various operational aspects, like working on a ship. All that, but great time, really enjoyed it, absolutely fantastic, done some interesting stuff. But when I got appointed to being vice president with TK, I can't commit to mobilising. I can't just leave the company for 6 months and say, thanks everyone, I'm off for 6 months. It's not fair in the Royal, it's not fair in the Navy, and it's not fair in TK. So I made the decision then to resign my commission. Lots of people do it. Lots of people will do like the 2-week commitment, which is absolutely fine. That's for them. But for me, it was more of a personal choice. I didn't think it was right taking the money and not saying that you would go if the balloon went up. So I thought that was a bit unfair. So that was just my own choice with that.
Do you think it's something that people should consider for coming ashore? To obviously people for the Royal Navy, it would be people in the UK, but do you think that would you recommend it? Do you think it had an impact on you that's helped you get to where you are?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, definitely. Actually, I mean, you do a lot of stuff is kind of unconscious that you do with the RN in terms of like leadership, the sort of management side of things, because everyone thinks that, you know, a lot of guys that are ex-forces, a lot of civilian employers will be reluctant to take them on because there's this sort of fear or bias that they think it's going to be like the old-fashioned sergeant major barking orders at everyone, where it is so far removed from that. That is not the case. They give you a lot of leadership training. And they talk about, and it's something that stays with me, the flexing your leadership style. So you can go into what you would class as warfighting mode, where it's very direct and it's, you know, you will do this and I want this done by then. And then there's the other side of the scale where it's much more collaborative and you're bringing people along with you, right, rather than, and don't get me wrong, there is times for both. If we are manning an ERT, we are dealing with a major incident on one of our vessels. That's the time for direct leadership, where it's very much, this has to happen, and it has to happen quickly. But then on normal times, right, or to Navy terms in peacekeeping mode, it's very much more collaborative. Doing that for over 10 years, that gave me both those sort of sides of the coin, as it were. Obviously, I'm biased with this one, but I would definitely recommend it. And in the branch that I worked in for the Navy was amphibious warfare, which is, they have opened it up, but it used to be exclusively merchant Navy guys that were in there. So you meet a whole load of people that are in there that are in different facets of the organisations. You know, there's guys from Shell, Chevron, and you're meeting them when you've quite literally got a different hat on, right? But you know, you meet a lot of people, and there's various touch points with the industry and all of that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend it. I think it's completely worthwhile.
You obviously just the names that you've said there, was that encouraged when you were like BP, or is that encouraging the oil majors?
It's not so, I wouldn't say it's encouraged, but crucially, it's not discouraged, right? So BP, for instance, at the time, it was called the Sabre Act, where they would give you, they were signed up to it. Now it's the employer engagement, or they've got various awards now for basically employer of choice for the armed forces, that sort of stuff. So silver, well, bronze, silver, gold. If you're a gold employer, then you allow your staff away to go and do the reserve time. So that's companies like Barclays and big organisations. So BP would allow you that time to go in away and do your reserve service, if that's what you wanted to do. It wasn't, not openly encouraged, but not discouraged. And I think that's the key thing, that it's not discouraged, because there'll be some employers out there that think, you know, I need to release this person for 2 weeks to go away and do their 2-week annual commitment, which, you know, it's not for all employers, but I think most big organisations do support it rather than encourage or discourage.
So then, obviously, we can just kind of, in terms of your, like, almost the run through of your career, you obviously then joined TK in 2016.
Yeah, so a couple of wee steps before that. Yeah, so worked in the North Sea for a year. Same guy, again, that phoned me about the job in the North Sea. He then moved over to BP Angola. And he was out in Singapore standing by this FPSO conversion. And again, phoned me and said, listen, there's this job coming up. I think you really want to have a look at it. And then had a look, and it was an incredibly exciting project. 2.4, so at the time, ultra-deepwater FPSO, never been done, first of its kind. So everything was sort of designed from the ground up, be it the ROVs, how we're going to install the subsea section. It was the most complex subsea construction ever done at the time. This was in 2014. Working in
this was a couple of little steps that were missing.
I mean, what an incredible job. Absolutely phenomenal. Moved over to Singapore. I was there for 2 years doing the construction and commissioning of this FPSO, and it was gigantic. You know, the logistics involved in it. I think it was something like a $2 billion capex just to get this one installation in. At the time, BP's biggest project, right, they'd ever sort of conceived in that sort of depth of water. So did that out in Singapore for 2 years. Absolutely brilliant. What a place to work. Obviously working back with BP as well, which was great. So it was, you know, along similar lines to the systems. But again, you know, still that really high level standard, because it was all offshore and it was upstream operations. So did that out in Singapore for 2 years working away, and then went to work in Luanda with it as well. So 2 years in Angola, sort of splitting the time between Luanda, back in the UK, and also offshore working on this particular installation. Now, 2 years is about the limit anyone can work in Angola. Right? I've still got colleagues that are still there, or ex-colleagues rather, that are still there. So they've stuck it out. Absolutely. Fair play to them. So 2 years, yeah. I think the corporate term is a challenging place to work, because obviously, you know, like all places in West Africa, you've got an element of corruption. So BP's stance on that was absolutely firm no, which then caused problems. And it's little things, like everyone laughs about going through the Suez Canal, which is colloquially called the Marlborough Canal, because you have to dish out cigarettes to the pilots, and it's expected, you know, and it's the same in West Africa. It's not briefcases full of money to win contracts, but it's like little things like gifts and all the rest of it. And the standpoint from that with UK bribery, just absolutely not, which then in turn, the knock-on impact with that is it just makes things tough. Getting technicians into the country, getting spares and stores out to the FPSOs. It's just a tough old place to work. So I did that, and then I was approached by a consultancy company back in Singapore to go back out there and do sort of consultancy work under FPSO and LNG stuff, which was obviously sort of getting ramped up. And yeah, so given the opportunity to go back to Singapore, which is again, probably, they call it Asia for beginners. Such an easy place to work as an expat. It's just really, really good. So I went back and worked with London Offshore Consultants out in their Singapore office and did that for 2 years. During that time, incredibly interesting work, was involved in the commissioning of 2 LNG terminals down in Australia in Glasgow. So that was GLNG and QGLNG at Curtis Island. So that was incredibly interesting because I was there representing insurance, right, to make sure that because it was a turnkey project that was handed over between the builders and over to the operations team. So it was ensuring that everything was managed correctly.
Who built Gladstone? Was that Downer?
The name begins with a B. I forget. It's a big American company as well. I'll find it. It'll come back to me, right? But they've done a lot of terminal stuff. They were involved in Wheatstone for Chevron down in West Australia. So that was 2 interesting jobs down there. I was actually down in Curtis Island over Christmas. I went down there in December. It was only meant to be for 2 weeks. It's never for 2 weeks. Never ever goes to plan. And I was there for Christmas, and it really is the back of beyond down in Curtis Island. And I was meant to come back.
I think the Aussies call it bum F nowhere. I can't believe I actually just censored myself. I don't need to do that. Anyway,
I think they call it, so it's the people that live in that sort of part of the world in Australia are called bogans. So basically like hillbillies. With the LNG terminal there and the money that was then involved, it's then cashed up bogans.
I think that's just any Aussies that work in I worked in Karratha for 2 years. Well, not for 2 years. I worked in Karratha for about a year and it was the exact same. But anyway, sorry, carry on.
So yeah, there over Christmas, and I was staying in this little self-catering, or these, what do they call, like executive apartments, right? For that. I was meant to fly back to the UK because my wife was still in Glasgow. She was still home. I was meant to fly home for Christmas, and obviously that was torpedoed. And then I came back from work and there was like a little letter posted through my door. I was actually talking to my wife at the time I was reading this, and it was for those that are by themselves over Christmas. The Salvation Army are having a drop-in if you want to go for your Christmas dinner. And she was killing herself laughing, saying, "You should go, please go. You and the homeless population of Gladstone." But fortunately, the insurance manager and the construction manager invited me around to their house for Christmas. So that was quite good. I wasn't a barbecue. I wasn't sat there myself, cracker for one.
I don't think it feels like Christmas when you're in Australia.
It's just so hot.
It's so weird. It's just totally different. So it almost doesn't feel like you're missing it. I remember we were out there and one of the local, he was actually a Welsh guy. He would decorate, he had this ute that it would only come out once a year. It had like a kind of flatbed on it, and they built a full Santa sleigh, and they used to get a police escort, drive it around because it's a very small town. I'm like, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah, so did that. 2 LNG terminals, still working for LOC. Did some offshore construction campaign work as well, which is interesting. Riser replacements in the Gulf of Thailand, which is considerably different from working in the North Sea. But like everything, all things come to an end. My wife was still back in the UK and she wanted us back home after being, doing all these different jobs in Luanda. And the job came up with TK in Glasgow we're looking at the time for an LNG assurance manager, and applied, was successful, and then moved back to the UK, or back to Glasgow in 2016.
How did you find the difference from going from the terminal in Bahrain, but so it's largely, was that 4 or 5 years of essentially project almost work?
Pretty much. It's interesting. I suppose it's quite a good transition, right? Because a lot of people, when you come direct from sea into an office, it's a huge cultural shift in how you're used to working. Whereas the way it was by complete accident, it wasn't by design. I've sort of eased myself into working ashore, from moving from sailing to offshore into construction and commissioning, and then consultancy, which is, even though it's based in the office, you do spend a lot of time out on jobs, because ultimately, as a consultant, that's where you make your money. The company makes money for you being in attendance somewhere. So it was that sort of mixture between sea or offshore, whatever you want to describe it.
You hear so many people when they talk about coming ashore, and some people, quite often, some people don't, it doesn't work for them and they go back within a year. And a lot of people coming ashore they don't understand, maybe if the company that they're applying for is a bit reluctant. For you in your position when you're bringing people in, or what advice have you got advice that you'd say to people coming ashore? Is it the right move or not?
It's funny, this exact circumstance is currently happening right now. So we had with a guy who I actually sailed with when I was third mate, and he was fourth engineer in 2002, something like that, like a million years ago. And he was sailing as chief engineer he approached us about coming ashore. And the advice is, you can't really give advice, you can explain it, right, as to what it's going to be like and the fact that it's a big change and all the rest of it. But until that person actually does it, they come behind the curtain and they're now working from a shore point of view, you can't describe it until they're actually doing it. And it's like everything is a risk, right? It's a gamble when from a shore point of view, you take someone that has no shore experience, but they've got an incredible background. They are such an asset to the company when you get someone like this chief engineer, LNG, done a lot of stuff. To get them in, to come into the technical team is a huge, it is great. They've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of input. They immediately have buy-in from the seafarers that they're dealing with because talking to a chief engineer. But sadly, it's not for everyone, and it's not for this chap as well. Exactly, you've described. He's done it for a year. He's going back to sea. That's what he's doing. It's not, I don't like working for TK or I don't like working ashore for TK. I just want to go back to sea. It's not for me. It's disappointing from us because obviously you take time on boarding people and getting them into the company ethos. But it's a risk you continually have to take because it brings that operational experience.
Do you guys operate in a way where, say, for example, I know from training officers, they'll look at members of crew and then obviously try and upskill them and push them on to the next one. Do you do something similar in terms of like a shore-based rotation for the permanent staff that you've got at seafarers? Or
what do you mean, they change ships? Or
say, for example, you've got a chief engineer or a second engineer that's highlighted that they might like to come ashore. Is there any kind of program in place where they can maybe do like almost like an internship ashore and they can get a taster of it?
Yeah, have you been sitting in our meetings, Gordon?
No.
That's something that actually, we've been discussing about, and it's been the catalyst for that is the situation that I've just described there. TK used to have graduate programs, so they would take guys that come from a naval architecture background, come in exactly like that, and they would go through various hoops to jump through before they eventually made it up to vessel manager. So what we're looking at doing is one, reinvigorating that program, right, not only just like for graduates, but also for our engineers that are at sea, right, to give them an opportunity to come in. And then the other one as well that we're looking at is short-term secondments. So we've obviously went through a huge fleet expansion program with ships coming out left and right. Problem with that is they're all due to dry dock at the same time, which puts a huge burden in the operational staff. So we're looking then to get some of the senior engineers in from sea and get them in secondment to give them a bit of a taste to the office, whether it's 6 months or 12 months or whatever the case may be. And then it allows them to sort of dip their toe in the water and see actually if it's for them, because some of the people that we have taken in short-term secondments, which is normally an HSEQ function, quite a few of them have actually stayed. So we had one chap who was in secondment for HSEQ that then moved into fleet support officer. Right. And then it's hoped that in time that sort of route for someone will then move up to vessel management. Yeah. So it's a good way for us. It's also great that it gives seafarers an opportunity to move ashore and staying in the same company without having to take drastic steps.
I suppose it's security as well, isn't it? Because it's a big step, whereas if you can do it with familiar people and familiar company, it makes a big difference. But
definitely.
So obviously you'd spent some time. I'm always curious, we mentioned this at the start of it, I'm always curious about the individual's levels of ambition. Now, you don't, forgive me if I'm wrong, but you don't get to VP level with any company without being ambitious. And when you spent time in Luanda and then you spent time in Singapore, was there anything that was really kind of pushing you? It's like, I want more, or you've been working for people, I want to get there. What was your thoughts on that? Was there anything?
I think most people that go into any sort of disciplined rank structure career, whether it's the armed forces, police, merchant navy, whatever, because as you're going through it, it's tiered. So you've always got that next rank to get to. So it's almost built into you that you do that. Now, maybe that's just me and that's not everyone's experience, but I think you can't help but be ambitious in the career that you're in, because right from the start, you start as a deck cadet, next step, third mate, all the way up to master. It's pathed out for you already. And if you've done it for so long, it's just ingrained in you. So you're always looking for that, that either next step or next challenge or something along those kind of lines.
And then, so when you come into TK, then obviously you come into the LNG assurance manager, and then as you said earlier on, it's been described, it's a meteoric rise. It's almost like every year you were getting promoted and moving on. Would someone just put an arm around you and just pushing you through? Or
it's hard for me to comment because obviously it was happening to me, so I suppose you would really need to ask Ian his thoughts on this, right? But I suppose it's like from the background that you come from and the projects that you've worked on, and everything's very much results driven. So, it's set a goal and achieve it. And it's that constant, you're always looking to achieve it. You're always like continuous improvement, make something better. If you come in and you looked at, so I came into assurance, that's all marine operations and SIRE, right, okay, so how can I make it better? Right, you do that. And that's what sort of identified then me, because I was banging the drum about competence, right? So obviously that's the big thing for our industry, and we're looking to mitigate experience matrices, there's several LNG ships. So we're looking to sort of mitigate competence with experience, etc. So I was sort of banging that particular drum. And at the time, TK decided that they wanted someone to head up marine HR from an operational background. So I was selected for that. So that's how I moved from LNG assurance manager over to head up marine HR. And it required a complete overhaul, right, of how we did things. Bearing in mind, this was under the backdrop of going from like 12 LNG vessels, 44, with a huge manning campaign to get people in, trained, competent, all of this sort of good stuff. And basically I delivered. That's the long and the short of it. And because manning is incredibly high profile within any organisation, because it's the people that are on the ships, and it's somewhat the forgotten aspect. Everybody sort of concentrates on operations and the technical side of things, which obviously has its place. But from a shore point of view, the vessel manager's not on the tools. He's not fixing your Jenny or if something's went down. It's the people on board that are fixing that. And if you get that wrong, everything will just, like a house of cards, will just come down. Again, delivered on that. That was basically it. So then an opportunity came up.
How many people is that? So obviously 12 vessels to 44, like what's the growth? Like what's your...
Basically, from a manning point of view, you're nearly quadrupling it in terms of the level of people that you had to come in. It's not just because that's very much firefight. We need all these people in, right? But then you also need to think a little bit longer term and strategic. Okay, so we can plug the gaps at the moment. Where do we want to be in 5 years? And then that's when you're looking at cadet programs and how are we going to push all these people up? How are we going to ensure that we have a pipeline, the staff rolling through? Because not only do you need to comply with time and rank and all that other stuff for charters, but it's also time and company. You can't have people being stuck in rank, not moving. You have to keep everything moving along, which when you move from an expanding fleet to a stationary fleet, you then need to think of other opportunities then, so hence why shore staff secondments, you've got the Bahrain terminal, so you can move people around with that. So yeah, and again, successful doing that, and then the position came up for fleet director. A lot of these jobs, interestingly enough, it's not that applied or anything like that, with the exception of marine HR. Everything else has been, by the way, Chris, and that was it. It was the same. One of the fleet directors left to take
Get on, go in and fix something else.
Aye, voluntold.
You didn't want to get into the engine room.
Nah, no thanks. Have you ever opened up a car bonnet after driving in the motorway, see how hot it is? It amazes me why people think that's a surprise. The engine rooms are hot. So yeah, and it was the same for fleet director. One of the guys, he left to take up a position in Singapore, and I got a phone call when he handed in his resignation. My boss saying, right, we're moving you in, fleet director.
Right.
To deal with that. And just what's been, TK is not the type of company, but you hear companies like BP, Chevron, etc. They identify people as high performers and they go into like a big bucket of high performers and they get moved around the organization. It's very, or it's meant to be, it's very like, okay, so this guy, we've got his career path mapped out, it's very much like that. TK, although from the outside looking in, it looks like a massive company. It's really not. It's actually quite small. In Glasgow, we have 106 people working in ops. We do have a footprint in Manila and Mumbai and obviously corporate in Vancouver, but it is very much, and I suppose it's always a bit, when people say this, right, and like, is that right? It's very much like a family company, right? I mean, it was founded by Torben Kalshoy, who started it himself and his family were involved in it. And that ethos is still kind of there, even though the foundation still makes up a bulk of the major shareholder. It's still that way inclined. It's not so much like that, right? You're now designated as high performer and we're going to move you through. It's almost, probably you would disagree, but it's almost like circumstance rather than design. But maybe that's just me being modest.
I wouldn't disagree. It's got a good, from what I do, it's got a good reputation. It seems like an agile company in terms of, and it's ambitious, but I would say everyone in it, the majority of people you speak to within it, they're happy. But I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. I'm just me. I'm not saying I'm right, but when you're pushing people through, and it doesn't seem as if it's just in the crew side of things, when you're promoting people from within, it just means that people want to buy into it and they're all about it. And it's a fairly young office when you think about it. Like, you can average age
Yeah, definitely.
Few clients recently saying it's like we need to actually, we're too top heavy and we've got a lot of people retiring in the next few years. We need, and now we're basically firefighting to fix it. Whereas I don't think that's not at all an issue with TK. It's very much a case of you come in and there's nothing you can't achieve almost.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And see the thing, so I'm a big fan of that, promoting from within, probably to the annoyance of in recruitment. But that, I think if you're you want people to be successful, you want people to come in at, vessel manager level or HSEQ or whatever the case is. And, there is opportunities to move around and do different things. You want them to remain in the organisation and you want them to move up. Not everyone can set the world on fire, right? And you're going to have people that are happy doing whatever they're doing, and that's fine. But you're also going to have people that are ambitious and they want to sort of move up, and being able to retain that. That's the challenge for me, for HR as well, to sort of keep people within the company. But yeah, you absolutely want to do that. I mean, our view on this is, if we can help it, we would never bring in anyone at senior level. That would always be from within, because it's such a risk when you bring someone in that's an unknown, right? It can really, really be disruptive. In the same way, it can also be, if you get the right candidate, it can be really good, but it is such a gamble. Moreover than that, if people within the company see that I'm not good enough and you're bringing in someone external, it's not a failing on them, it's actually a failing on the organisation that we've not developed them enough to be in a position ready to take the next step.
I probably shouldn't say it, but yeah, I think you're right. See, when you look back, so obviously right now, I get the impression that you love what you do, to be fair, but when you look back, I mean, what part of your career, when you're sitting on a Friday night with a glass of wine, do you look back and go, love that, or you tend to tell the stories of that time again? Is there a particular time, or is it now?
It's not now. I was only appointed in June when I took over from Ian, so I'm not quite that all wispy on a Friday night thinking, yeah, particularly not under the backdrop of COVID. I don't think that there's not one. There's standout parts in your career where you think, yeah, that was really good. The BP Angola one in particular, the moment sail away, that was really satisfying. The ship coming out of the yards under its own power for a couple of hours, and then we had to get it towed. Right? But that was really good. Again, first oil on PSVM, that was quite special then as well. We had Dallas, the theme tune from Dallas blasted out. Little moments like that where you think, and it's, to be honest, it's not so much, I suppose it's not the process, it's the people around it, right? So you remember the guy who was sat next to me at the time that I still see, we still play golf. He lives in Thailand, I meet him when I go over to Singapore. Him and I were in the control room when that happened, right? I suppose really the offshore campaign, see the things that I've described to you, because I mean, there's loads, right? There's absolutely loads and loads of stuff. They're the sort of standout career highlights. It sort of creeps up on you and you just like have a little bit of a smile and you think, oh yeah, I remember that.
What's next for TK? Is it changes coming? Is there anything what you're able to say?
Well, I mean, the big thing, like everyone now, is sustainability and what that's going to look like for 2030, 2050. So there's a lot of work going into what is next for TK. Obviously, I'm very much focused on the gas side of things, and LNG is considered to be, rightly or wrongly, whether people agree or disagree, it is considered a clean fuel, and it is considered to be what's going to be a gateway fuel as ships move into various other means of propulsion and fuel. Coming into 2030 and 2050, BP, for instance, Bernard-Looney's already stated that they're going to, I think it's treble their LNG output and all of that. So, I mean, in terms of future for us and sustainable, we're in really, really good shape. We've went through fleet expansion, and it's good to take a bit of a breath after having done all that, because it's been, for want of a better word, frantic getting all these ships coming out. And it's not just your bog standard LNG vessels, you have the whole working up in the Arctic, never been done before. That came with its own challenges. What's next for us? I can't say too much on this, but there's big tenders coming out that we're going to be going involved in. So hopefully we'll be going in for another period of expansion in the coming years. But again, the expansion has to be right for the business. It has to have the right risk profile and the correct investment rate of return. It's worth it. What I can say is there's certain ones that we absolutely bowed out of. Mozambique LNG, not for us. The risk profile is quite high. Working down there was another Yamal 2, back up in the Arctic, but we've already got 6 vessels up there, so we didn't want to have, and it's like everything, like all good businesses like to spread the risk. So rather than having all your eggs in the Arctic basket or all your eggs in the Africa basket, it's important to sort of spread it around. I think for us, obviously, we'll be looking along the lines of your conventional LNG stuff. That's always going to be the case, but again, it's forming part of this 2030 strategy. What else do we want to be involved in? We've got the Bahrain terminal over there, which is a offshore regas unit with an FSU. Is that something we want to be getting involved in as well? Probably. It's quite a developing market, gas to power, look to get involved in that. But again, it has to be for the right project. It's not just a case of doing anything. It's very much, is that a right fit for TK? Is that what we want to get involved in? The other thing is like the small scale LNG, which we are involved in. We do have ethylene carriers as well. How's that going to look? Really tracking demand and what things are going to look like for the future.
What about yourself? Have you any plans to move to Vancouver?
No, no. That from the corporate side of things, obviously, that's where Vancouver is. My boss is out there. He's the CEO, and then you've got the board and all that sort of stuff. So that's out there at the moment. So no plans. It's a nice place to visit, but no plans to move out to it.
There's plenty more I want to ask you, to be honest. Some of the things I ask everyone that comes on, it's about the influences. Obviously, you've spoke about a few people in different parts of your career, early days with your granddad, but is there anyone that you'd say has been a big influence on your career?
I wouldn't say there's not one particular standout person, and the reason that is because obviously you move around, right? So in particular when you're sailing, you work with some incredible captains and some incredible engineers that you work with, who do a lot of mentoring with you and all of that. So when you're at junior level and you work with people that have that sort of influence, because at that point it's them that instill the professional standard, and you look to them and think, actually that's what I want to be. So there's captains that I sailed with in BP, incredible guys, really professional, loads of integrity, do things right, say what they do what they say, all this sort of stuff, or walk the talk, whatever sort of corporate euphemism you want to use. Same in BP Angola, loads of guys, incredibly professional people. Even moving to LOC, my old boss Nick Haslam as well, big influence, just super knowledgeable, always wanted to do the right thing, do the best job that you possibly could. So you meet all these different people along your career that really do influence you. At the time, you don't think, oh, I'm being really influenced by you. But when you look back on it, it's these guys that sort of instill that level of professionalism, and it's hoped, right, that I do the same, right, on other people that you sort of come into contact with, and that's how it all sort of goes along. It is different when you move around because you're not working with the same people all the time. That can be an advantage or a disadvantage to whatever way you want to look at it. In the same way you sail with some really good guys, you sail with some absolute zoomers, right?
Is that corporate speak again there?
Zoomers, yeah. I shouldn't have really said that.
You never sailed with TK, so
no.
Back in the day,
all good guys there. I do remember when I was sailing and thinking, if I end up staying here my entire career, I'm going to turn into some of these guys. The Model Railway Brigade. Nothing wrong with Model Railways, just not for me. I
know I'll get you for Christmas. Last question. What's your first memory of the industry? What's your first memory of being a vessel or being a ship, or did you get anything from your childhood? Or?
The first memory of that is because, again, living in Lindsay, you're not in a port or anything like that, so you're not waving at ships as they go past. I suppose the main thing would be joining your first ship. That's really imprinted on you. And out of all the ones that you then work on, it's that one that you always remember. I remember the date that I joined it. So it was on the 4th of January in 1998. And it was in a place called Djibouti. Now, I got a phone call, and I think it was like December the 20th, the London office to say, right, Chris, you're joining the Shiboni. You're joining in Djibouti. You got a pen, here's your flight details. And I came off the phone, and my mum's like that, oh, where are you going? I was like, oh, Djibouti. She's like, what is that? I was like, I have no idea. I had to get in, because obviously the days before smartphones and all this stuff, I had to get an atlas, right, and find out where Djibouti was. It's in East Africa, for those that don't know. It's in the Horn of Africa, as it's called. Yeah, joined that, had 3 days in Djibouti and joined this ship. And I remember walking along the jetty wall and looking at this thing, thinking, how the hell have I ended up here? Like a wee squeaky voice 17-year-old from Lindsay is in East Africa about to join this thing. That was my overriding. That's my first memory of that.
Well, Chris, it's been a pleasure. Thanks again. Really enjoyed it. Stories like that, it just makes it worthwhile for me as well. I love all that kind of stuff. I love hearing it's not always where you are right now, it's where you came from. So no, I appreciate it. But thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll get you back on.
Aye, thanks Gordon. Thanks very much for having us.